All right, I think we'll get going. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. This is a webinar on getting us AI ready on Azure and the governance strategies that are ideal and definitely required in the future and how we can approach that. So yeah, with that, I welcome you all. Myself, Sunir Mahmood, I work as a data and AI architect for Concurrency. So yeah, like I have slides around like roughly 25 slides. So I'm gonna time it and explain it and also keep a track of the time and try to pace it through. That being said, please feel free to ask your questions, and I would appreciate if we can keep when I'll be attending to those questions towards the end so that we can cover everything that is needed. But I'll try to make it as quickly as possible as well. So thank you, Paige, for confirming that you can see my screen. So moving on. So what are we planning to cover in this webinar? We'll talk a little bit about the data and AI maturity curve, why governance matters, right? The key pillars of data and AI governance, tools and services within Azure, a little bit of deeper look into that, some architectural patterns, process recommendations, and common governance challenges, some case studies, in fact, one case study, um, some upcoming regulations from current and upcoming regulations, and then we'll conclude with that and move on to question and Q&A, in fact. I hope everybody is okay with that agenda. And moving on, a lot of you might have seen this data and AI maturity curve before. If not, I'll spend some time to explain this. This talks about how an organization starts, right? Mostly organizations start with like minimal data infrastructure, right? So they would have business needs to actually analyze some data as they start off. They would start something like some manual processes with spreadsheets and so on and so forth, and have different methods of crunching those numbers. Might not have a standard you know way of calculations and so on and so forth, the data and the code base of whatever they do. Well, there is nothing to say as code base per se in this particular phase, but all of those processes will be spread across different systems, right? So that's the first step. And the next step of the maturity phase is the descriptive phase, where you would go into a traditional data warehouse environment, right? So that's when you get to do some like foundational data warehouse, some facts and dimensions, as you call it in a typical data warehouse language. Facts are the numbers and dimensions are the qualifiers for those numbers, right? It can mean a customer, a product, and so on and so forth, right? Traditionally, a data warehouse would have data coming from one system, and you would have repeatable visualizations like Power BI on top of it, where you could update the data and see new numbers, and so on and so forth. So that is more like retrospective or descriptive reporting, right? Like you're looking back into the history. Now, moving forward, if your data estate gets matured a little bit, you move into a modern data framework, right? So a modern data framework would mean that you'll get a little bit more of diagnostic capability into your data. That would mean that you would have a centralized data warehouse, you would have a data lake, mostly self-service BI, and from you will have a holistic look of your data altogether. if there is a system, if your organization have several ERPs, and you want to combine all of that data together, this is the maturity point where you would say that you have a modern data framework and you have a holistic look at your data, right? So that would mean that you would create a data cataloging, you would have data quality rules, manage your lineage documentations, and so on and so forth. Now, these are all retrospective, right? Like now we are getting into the predictive world. Like what can we see for the future, right? We have historical data now. Like what can we see, into the future? So when we talk about machine learning, we have the concepts of like linear regression, which helps us predict, for example, sales numbers or revenues or whatnot, right? Like I have the historical data. I have a machine learning model for my linear regression to actually predict what can happen in the future, right? So I have good enough data, qualified data to actually train a model and test that data and make predictions out of it. Going on a step further, like we get into the wisdom or optimization or a prescriptive, level. So, which would mean that you can further use that data, like for sentiment analysis or customer classifications or segmentation. In proper machine learning language, we call it logistic regressions. Excuse me. So that is like you can do several categorizations, right? Like, hey, you want to see if your customer is satisfied, whether you want to see how where do you want to invest more, what kind of a business segment do you want to invest more, what kind of a customer category should you focus more if you have not categorized that, like, and so on and so forth. And the past 2 years, we have seen a significant boost into the innovation part of it, right? Like, generative AI, this is a buzzword, right? Like, LLM, large language models, retrieval augmented generation, and all that we have been hearing about. And it has started influencing us quite a lot, right? It has democratized this artificial intelligence to, widely, right? All of us use AI in some or the other form. Earlier, we used to use AI without our knowledge. Now we actively use AI. For one classic example is like we use Copilot summaries to understand, like, what, like, nobody has to write any summarization, right? Like you get the summarization yourself. You get a complete look into who spoke what, what are the takeaways, what are the to-dos after that meeting, and so on and so forth. You can actually draft a pretty professional looking email with the help of Copilot AI, right? And then you can not just text or framing of words or drafting emails. You can also create images. You can create videos. The content generation industry, like the social media, the content generators, have been using this primarily, right? Like, as well. So it's getting into an interesting world. So these are the, like, you need very good data for you to have good models, for you to actually ground your models based on your internal knowledge base. So these are the different maturity levels that you would have in a data landscape. And then based on your scenario, what do you want to implement? What do you want to go first? Your prioritization, you productize that, so I hope that makes sense. And moving on. So let's talk a little bit about why does governance matter, right? Like what is governance after all, right? Governance means you are really on top of your data quality, right? You know what your data estate is inside out. You manage it really well. You avoid any risk and compliance, right? Thereby building trust and transparency for not just your data process, but your AI process as well, right? So when I talk about AI amplifies data issues, your AI model or your machine learning models is only as good as your data. I'm sure a lot of you might have heard garbage in, garbage out, right? the data is not good, you make a model that gives you a biased output or not the right output, right? Um, it can have unfair, outcomes, right? Based on the amount of data that you're training on or the biased data that you train that with, right? And if you have impure data, the output could completely be wrong, right? So, and talking about risk and compliance, you could also have sensitive data, right, in your system. And mostly personal data is never used to actually train an AI system. But you should know, if on a mature data landscape, that do I have sensitive data? What am I using to train my model, right? You should have those guardrails to prevent any misuse and protect personal data as well and comply with the laws, right? So if you do all that, then we build the trust, right? Trust with not just the users, but with the world out there as well, right? So that gives transparency into the AI, how it uses data and make decisions, and how do we do that? That governance, is through documentation, lineage tracking, and oversight. And we'll get into that a little bit more in deeper, and how Azure approaches that. And thereby, you drive business values, right? You can discover data silos in your data estate. You can streamline access to high quality data, speed up AI development, right? So modern data governance actually enables us to confidently ensure AI readiness, right? So speaking of which, let's talk about key pillars of the AI and data governance, right? So earlier it used to be called data governance. Now AI is so much a thing, and AI and data is so close together. So, most of what AI governance is derived from data governance, because those go hand in hand, in fact. So the key pillars of governance is having a unified data catalog and discovery. So what does that mean? It means you have an inventory of all data assets, data lakes, your databases, and so on and so forth, right? And to be talking specifically about Microsoft tools, we'll get into tools in a detailed fashion, but Azure Purview is something that lets you scan all your data assets across your landscape, and then say that, hey, these are the different landscapes that data assets that you have, and you have this kind of data over here. You have, that data over there, and so on and so forth. We'll get into specific examples. And this also governance another key pillar is data classification. We want to classify what is a publicly categorized data, what is a personal data, what is a sensitive data, and so on and so forth. And not only just for AI usage or train AI, also for a data systems perspective, right? We don't want users accessing confidential data or personal data unless they have to, right? So there has to be control. For example, there could be personally identifiable data, financial data, etc. And also, as the core topic of this is we want to make sure that the AI is only trained on the data that it actually needs, right? Not on any personal sensitive data. And we need to have data quality and lineage tracking. So let's say, for example, while projecting a dashboard or a report where somebody is looking at some metrics, we want to see hey, how did we end up calculating this particular sales numbers, right? Which all layers did it get transformed through? What all is undergoing to that particular field, right? This also applies for a feature engineering. So when I talk about feature engineering, what that means is you actually source into the model, hey, you need to use this particular dimension, or you need to use this particular field to train your model. For example, it could be something like a survey or demographics information, and so on and so forth, right? So you want to understand, looking at a particular field, what all transformation did it go through, both from a lineage perspective to understand, hey, where is this coming from? What all did it go through? Also, if you go upstream all the way, because data flows like through different pipelines and finally it ends into its pristine form, right? So on the upstream perspective, if I were to make some change over here, where all is it going to get affected? I would want to know, right? So that kind of you should have that hold on your data, right? And then it comes to access control and security, right? You don't want to, like everybody to have all the access across your data landscape. You would have roles and permissions for certain set of users, or you could have regional based split for your users. You would have managers looking at data from North America versus you would have certain set of users looking at European Union data. They're only responsible for that section. So you could have those kind of access controls, or you could have privilege-based access control as well. Somebody can see the sensitive data because their job roles requires. Somebody does not have to see that right? Because they don't need it. And then it comes to lifecycle management and data minimization. So what that means is like adhering to certain compliances, right? For example, you might have heard of GDPR compliance and so on and so forth, right? Like, hey, I should retain only minimal amount of data. I should not have any additional data that is not needed for my day-to-day business or reporting purpose, right? I should purge the data that is not needed in my system. I should mask the personally identifiable data. Also, something like GDPR compliance has something like a right to forget. If a customer wants to, wants their data to be deleted from a certain system, they can request for that, and that should be deleted, right? And on top of this, monitoring all this, right? Monitoring like who all is accessing the data at different levels, how is that data being used, what are the queries that they're throwing, like, where all are they actually extracting the data into, and so on and so forth. So these are the key pillars or best practices of data governance. Moving on. Now let's talk about the technology, right? Like, what is that technology landscape which helps us achieve those key pillars of data governance, right? Which is becoming more and more important. So Purview, we cannot speak data governance without speaking Purview in Azure. Microsoft's Purview, I would say it's a cornerstone of data governance, right? It's a unified data governance service that helps us discover, catalog, classify, and manage data across the entire data estate. Now, a typical data estate, at least until 2-3 years ago, even in Azure Cloud, would mean that you would use multiple services, like a service to actually pipeline your data, like your data engineering pipeline, that's called Data Factory, by the way. You would have like your operational storage of your data in a relational fashion, something like Azure SQL databases, or you could have file-based storages too. Like, you could store image data, you could store other forms of data. You could have semi-structured data that is coming from your IoT devices and so on and so forth in a file-based storage. So depending on your needs, there are different types of services that is available in Azure, right? Azure Cloud. So you end up having different services that you use, and then the data pipeline services, which helps move data from one to another by transforming, right? So if you have all of these, how do you have a one common bird's eye view of what all is out there, right? So that's what Purview used to provide, right? And Purview can actually scan all this data assets and say that you have this particular Azure SQL database, and these are the tables that is there, these are the fields that is there, and this field is getting used, and so on and so forth, right? And you can also catalog your data, right? Like might want to catalog one set of data or set of KPIs or key performance indicators as your sales and revenue data. Or you might want to categorize one set of files as your customer feedback, right? Once you catalog that, it's very easy to go in and say, I want to find everything about my customer feedback because I'm building a model, to do sentiment analysis, for example, right? So that helps tremendously when we catalog the data. Then there is classification and sensitivity labels as well, right? Like you can say that, you know what, this is a PII data, this is a personal data, this is sensitive, and then have rules around that, like, for accesses and policies and all, right? I already mentioned about data lineage, the concept around that. So Purview helps with that. And another advantage is that, you can actually create a business glossary, right? Which is definitely required as and when your data estate is maturing, right? Like, oh, now you say you have a data warehouse, but I don't know what is that you have in your data warehouse. I have sales data. Okay, what all do you have in your sales data? Well, I have sales and revenue. Okay, so does that mean you have sales, margin, your cost? Yes. So to avoid this back and forth, if somebody were to create that business glossary, it is very time consuming if you actually manually do it. But this classification and labeling of this data and cataloging this data helps users, create a glossary out of Purview and say that, this is what I have. You can go use it as you want based on your access, right? Purview also provides multi-cloud hybrid support. It does not just strictly on, it does not only strictly look at Azure. So if there are your data estate in other cloud like AWS S3, for example, or if you have on-prem databases, we can scan that too. So a one-stop shop for data governance, I would say. Moving on. Yeah, this is some sneak peek into the connectors, right? You can see on the right-hand side, there is AWS connectivity. Within Azure itself, you have like, Azure Synapse Analytics, Azure Cosmos DB, MySQL databases, blob storages, Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2. You can connect to an AWS account or AWS S3, RDS storages, a version of PostgreSQL storages for Amazon, and so on and so forth, right? So it provides multi-cloud support. Apologies for the resolution here. I don't think it's that great, but you get the point, right? So, and for scanning, right? Like there are built-in classification rules within Azure, right? You want to say, you want to categorize your data based on government classification rules or finance classification rules, right? Let's pick the example of finance. I have sales and margin data that is I've populated into the data warehouse, and I want to use Purview's built-in classification to actually, use that, categorize my data, right? So it look into my data estate and say that, this is your sales number, and this is your customer date. I mean, sorry, not customer name. Customer first name, last name, email address. It can look at to that perspective. This is your cost data. This is your margin. These are the products that was sold, right? Like it can actually look at that data, including the data type, and tag it accordingly with the built-in classification rules. Purview also allows for you to create custom rules, right? Sometimes what is there in the standard classification rules might not be tailored to the business needs that we have. So we can create custom rules to scan the data and classify that. This is a screenshot into data lineage, right? I spoke about data lineage. So I am looking at something in my data warehouse, and I don't know how did they derive this number, right? Like, although I believe the number that I see, right? Like, although I believe that the number of customers or the number of products that I see, I don't know where all of this is getting sourced from. So from this typically goes from left to right, for those of who are relatively new, right? So on the right-hand side is my final object that I would be looking at. And I want to see even where is it coming from, right? In my report, where is it being get used and all, right? What all transformation is it going? So this is a little bit of, a sneak peek into that. This is a view within Purview itself. So that I understand, right? This applies for feature engineering as well. Did my data go through some standardization, or did it go through some data quality, like data imputing, or treating nulls and so on and so forth? Is this particular field something that I can use for, excuse me, my model, right? Alternatively, I can also look at, if I happen to change something in the source, how a report would get impacted. Where all is it getting used? Who all is using that, right? Which all tables are it getting fed to? Which all reports are it getting fed to? I have that kind of a control. What kind of machine learning pipelines is it going to? Have that kind of a control within Purview. Now getting into Azure Data Lake governance and Microsoft Fabric. It's very important to talk about Fabric here, because Fabric is a strategic direction of Microsoft for their data warehouse, or their data estate approach in general, I can say. So traditionally, if you look at the first bullet points, you would have Azure Data Lake storages like ADLS, relational databases, Azure SQLs, and several different services, right? And somebody would go with a zone-based or Medallion architecture. We'll discuss about what Medallion architecture is in a future slide. But to my earlier point, right, connecting back to my earlier point, they would have different services, and they would have to use something like Purview to have this holistic look, right? I have these many objects in my data estate. I know that where my sales data is, customer feedback data is. They need to have Purview. Purview scan the entire data estate to see all that. But with Fabric, data governance is not an afterthought, right? Data governance approach gets baked into Fabric, right? Fabric comes with the concept of OneLake. So what that means is everything that you have within your data estate is present in your OneLake. So you don't have to go to a different service to access that. You have data that is stored in your relation database. It is there in OneLake. You have data that is stored, like a files that is stored. It is there in OneLake. You have your pipelines. Well and good. It's there in your OneLake, right? You have your machine learning pipelines, still there, right? You don't have to go anywhere else. And Fabrics lets you actually manage your workspaces so that you don't have to worry about, oh, now I have everything. How do I manage? It's totally up to you on how you want to manage, right? You want to have workspace based on finance or HR, or you want to have workspace based on your development/production, or you want to have workspace based on your regional categorization of your data. It's up to you. You author it, you decide, you design. It's nimble enough so that you can be creative with that. And it comes with built-in Purview integration. So with Fabric, data governance, which is getting a lot more significance and importance as AI, and the data that is backing the AI is getting a lot more significant importance. With Fabric, governance is not an afterthought. Governance comes baked in with Fabric. So let's look at that. Okay, I just wanted to touch base a little bit about, what all Fabric, has. I had mentioned about Data Factory, Data Warehouse. It used to be called as Synapse Data Warehouse. They have not renamed it. You're just using Synapse Data Warehouse within that. So, and then your data engineering pipelines. I hope data warehouse is a very common and understood term with all of the audience over here. But for the people, who are relatively new, data warehouse is the final pristine data destination for a performant, analysis of your data, excuse me, analysis of your data. You build your reports or dashboards from a data warehouse. So, and then you have data engineering pipelines, right? Your data science machine learning pipelines, right? Your real-time analytics. You have Power BI for visualizations and data activators in the mix, right? If you want to do something based on something that happened with your data. Like, for example, I have some new customers that have come into the system. They do not have their hierarchy associated with that. They do not have their parent customer associated with that. I want to alert my data stewards or list of users that I have certain new customers that need to be acted upon so that they can map to their respective parents. So I can write a data activator rule to actually, alert the users. So all of these services, which were actually different services before, comes under one ecosystem of Fabric, and all of this can be available in OneLake. So these are several components of that. So I'm not gonna go through that in detail, but this is what it is. And this is a sneak peek from our own development landscape that I just took a screenshot of for sanity purpose, and I've just masked the customer's name. But you can see, like in a OneLake, if you look at OneLake, you can see, if you look at the type over here, you can see a mirror database, you can see a warehouse, you can see a SQL Analytics endpoint. All of these have different purpose, right? For example, Lake House, as you see over here, that is something that you can store the data. You want to store a structured data which has fixed columns, and you exactly know what is there in every column. Like in a spreadsheet, you can store that in a lake house. You don't know what the structure of the data that is coming in. You call it a semi-structured, mostly happens in IoT devices and stuff. You can store that in a lake house. Warehouse, I already explained what a warehouse is. SQL Analytics endpoint, which will help you, do your for analysts who are SQL savvy, can do their SQL based analytics on data that is stored in files. Semantic model is something that is created underneath of Power BI so that it caters to Power BI for all the visualizations. Like, for example, if there is a pie chart or something like a graph, like a bar chart or something, like what is that dimensions or KPIs, and how are they actually related? That semantic models actually define that. So you can see everything which was earlier different services comes under one catalog, right? So that's a sneak peek. Again, this is again another sneak peek into Fabric lineage, right? We did not have to turn on Purview, in this particular project because we were actually working on Fabric. And as I said, Purview is baked into Fabric. Now I know that, like, I have a database over here which is getting mirrored without the movement of data into Fabric. I have this over here, and that is getting used in multiple places. You can see these small arrows, right? Like I'm using that in several data engineering pipelines to actually massage that data and feed it to further points, right? So that gives me like where all is my data being used. If I make a small change over here, I know where all it will get where all it will get impacted, right? If I make a small change over here, I can look at the lineage of this specific item and see like, oh, this could break my next pipeline, or this could break my next model or my report. So again, this is my point that like data governance is not an afterthought in Fabric. We in my first slide I mentioned about, we'll talk about certain architectural patterns, right? And I briefly mentioned about Medallion architecture. Typically in a data warehousing or a data estate scenario, we go with a bronze, silver, gold pattern. for movement of data. So you can see, look at it from a left to right perspective, right? Like that's how the data gets promoted from one layer to another. It moves forward, right? So typically this architectural pattern is a widely followed architectural pattern, although the name was coined maybe 3 or 4 years ago, but the pattern has been followed for several years, right? Like, for years, in fact. I would say ever since the data warehouse concept has been there. So bronze is like the first layer of landing your data as is from your source systems. You could have different source systems. As you can see on the left-hand side, there's files, there are databases, there are sensors, there are business apps. You land in exactly as is. Don't worry about like any cleanup. Don't worry about like, what you're extracting, how you're, not how, but what you're extracting, whether you want to transform that data or not, right? And silver is like, as you can, the name implies, right? Like the next best or better, medallion layer, right? Like, okay, now the data gets into a much more refined or quality controlled data, right? You take care of any duplicates, or you take care of any nulls. You make sure that the data integrity is there, right? Uh, integrity is an arguable standpoint, but still, again, like you clean up the data a little bit as it progresses. From silver, and when the data moves to gold, is your pristine level, for storing the data for analytics. There, the data should be in 100% purity for not just your reports to get used, but also to use for for your models and so on and so forth. Right? You can arguably say that like I can use the data from silver itself, but the pattern here of medallion, the concept of medallion is that you improve the data quality as you move forward. You make sure that the data is has integrity between them. And I say integrity like, hey, am I representing any revenue generation or a sales generation without saying like which customer contributed to that, right? Which product did I sell to get that sales number, and what was the quantity? So in order to qualify certain numbers, I need to have integrity to the different data aspects, right? So that referential integrity enforcement and all happens as the data moves forward. So typically, this is a recommended architectural pattern so that you don't have silos of your data process and storage, right? You don't have disparate ways. So speaking of which, I'll quickly move on to Azure Policy. So what does Azure Policy mean, right? Like it's a tool for enforcing governance, right, across Azure resources, right? So, well, purviews for data, I mean, governing your data content. Azure Policy actually governs the cloud infrastructure or configuration, right? So you can create an Azure Policy to say that, you know what, I don't want to, any storage which does not have encryption enabled. That could be a compliance requirement for your system. Microsoft by standard, it encrypts the data at rest and in transit, by the way. I only want to deploy my Azure OpenAI service in a particular region, right? So those could be your Azure policies, right? What are the use cases for that, right? You can make sure that a particular AI service that you're deploying for a particular customer base in a specific region can remain in that particular region. When you actually create services within Azure Cloud, you can say that it needs to be in this particular region. And if you have that policy running, and if you create it otherwise, that policy will not let you create it. You can also require tagging, right? Like, hey, I am the owner of this AI service that I'm creating. I know that I'll delete it after a while, or like, this is for this particular purpose. This is for this particular client, right? I can actually ensure that these tags are there, or I can write guidelines that these need to be there. If not, let it fail the validation while it is creating, right? It also lets have Azure blueprints or have infrastructure as a code, right? means like once you have all these policies written in some landscape, you can move it as a code. You don't have to write it again into your next landscape, like your test or your production, or if you're creating a new subscription altogether, you don't have to do that from the scratch, right? It also helps us to, monitor this continuously, right? Like, is there any other object that is not uh, adhering to this policy, right? Can have dashboards like, and say that like, 75% of your objects are adhering to these policies, and 25 are not. And these are the objects, these fail the policy that, some of your rules are not, honored in that objects, right? So let me see if yeah. So for the sake of it, I tried creating an object in our landscape without, following the Azure policy requirements, so that I could show you, right? So you can see on the left-hand side that, it enforcing the primary owner tag compliance has failed. So this is what happens when I create a resource within Azure, right? Enforcing the client tag compliance has failed. Enforcing the expected delete tag has failed. And there is, on the right hand side, there is a written explanation, beautiful explanation by Copilot, right? How beautifully the generative AI works to explain you that, what, this is why your creation is failing. This is the bash command that is written inside, which is failing it. This is a partial command, right? And what you should do, right? It's giving you a descriptive, information into why it failed. So this is because there is a active Azure policy there. I hope that makes sense. This is for the infrastructure. Now, let's talk a little bit about responsible AI. Um, you know, um, so Azure actually hosts OpenAI, right? A lot of people have questions like, hey, what if I use Azure hosted OpenAI, right? Does my data get sent to the public internet or OpenAI itself? The answer is no. Microsoft Azure environment keeps that data within, and it does not send to the public internet, or it is not used for training OpenAI models at all. Your data remains your data. So you can, if you actually use Azure OpenAI service, uh, it's not going to be sent anywhere else. It's going to be within your subscription, your cloud. It's not going to be available to anyone else. So yeah, like something like GDPR, which I mentioned about, earlier. These kind of compliances can be adhered to if you know this, right? And there is like also another aspect of is like you might want to have content filters, right? You might want to avoid any hate speech, or you might want to make sure that there is no profanity or anything undesirable content as an output of your model, right? There are content filters available within Azure, so that you can tweak the knobs of different sensitivity levels, and let the model adhere to that, right? Yeah, and talking about controlling the AI model usage, right? There is a AI Foundry model catalog, by the way. Like, if you look at OpenAI, there are different models that could be used within OpenAI. There is ChatGPT 4.0, O3 model, O4 mini, O4 mini high, all of this. Like, all of these models have different use cases. So if you want to be, if you are researching on something, you would rather use one model. If you're writing codes and asking feedback about the code, you would rather use another model. So you can actually decide what model should your organization use based on the use case. It could be based on the use case, or it could be based on the performance of that performance metrics of that model, or it could be based on how recent and how vetted out that model is, right? So that is there. You can have a controlled AI model usage as well. This is an example of content safety studio, right? Like, if you get into a content safety studio, you can see that there is a moderate text content section, right? I'm going to quickly show you that example, a screenshot of that, right? So there is a safe content example, right? Multiple risk categories example. If I were to read that out, a 51-year-old man was found dead in his car, blood stains and so on and so forth, which probably you might not want to output as a part of your model, right? Like, so you can tweak those, the violence level, the self-harm level, the hatred, sexual level, like, all of that into different thresholds, whether you want to allow it or block it or, keep it medium, and then test your output and then let your model run accordingly. So that means you're like, actually monitoring and controlling, the output of that. So this is from a snapshot from the window itself. Yeah, and I spoke about like different models that could be used, right? So you can see that there are different GPT models like O3 Mini, 4.5. There are even DeepSeek models, right? And you can decide in your Foundry, what are the models that you would let your organization use. So that is possible. Moving on. What are the common data governance challenges, right? So we discussed about excuse me. Yeah, we discussed about the silos, right? Like if the data is in several different places, you don't have no control. You don't know if you have valuable data assets in some places which you could use very well for your model or your reports, or if you would have sensitive data here and there, you don't know that, like, so you like in the sense like um, these you need to have a proper data governance to actually get a hold of all this, right? um, and ensuring data quality and consistency, we already covered that, right? Like, you want to make sure that your data is pristine towards the usage, the final usage of it, be it historical reporting analytics, be it for predictive or AI model research usage, so on and so forth. uh, Privacy and compliance concerns, not just for adhering to compliances, but also for gaining trust, right? Bias or ethical issues. If you're training your model based on biased data, it's going to provide, output biased, outputs, right? And if you have your data estate across multiple multi clouds or different on-prem versus cloud, that's a problem, right? So, and then there are cultural and organizational hurdles. Mostly these teams like AI teams and machine learning teams want to move quickly. So if there are a lot of governance practices, there is a perception that it could slow them down. But actually, if you have proper governance, it only eases all of this because you know where your pristine data is. Have control about where your data is coming from. You have trust on your data, and you can project that trust to your clients and also to the compliance audits and so on and so forth. A use case that I wanted to just bring in is like, we have a global manufacturing company specializing in motion actuation and control technologies, and they're using Azure Fabric to build analytics, sourcing the data from varying ERP systems. This company is not a single company, it's an umbrella of different companies, right? So they are actually creating an end-to-end analytics where their process is not merged together. Like, when I say this, actually, in actuality, this is like extracting data from 12 different companies, right? And forming a proper Medallion architectural pattern to one common structure and using Fabric. And thereby with Fabric, we have absolute control about where the data is coming from, from which source, and how is a particular number being formed, and so on and so forth. So we are building the analytics layer, and this will be very, since governance is baked into the solution, which is Fabric, it will very well be used and very it'll provide a lot of advantage going into the predictive realm, generative realm, and so on and so forth. Even though they have not merged the processes and ERP systems across these different companies. All right, so some evolving regulations. So GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation. I already covered that a little bit. Like, there is right to forget. If a customer wants to delete their data from the system, they can. They can request, and we are bound to do that. And minimal data retention in our system. These are all some examples of GDPR. And European Union AI Act is forthcoming. So we need to keep an eye out for that if your business is in the European Union. Um, so if again, this first four bullet points are like international, regulations that are out there, and some of them are forthcoming, right? For example, personal data protection law by Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and Qatar cloud computing regulation law, right? So if you are doing business internationally, you need to adhere to all of this, and there is absolutely no way other way around, other than having proper data governance on your system, right? Similarly, California Privacy Act, that is already an enacted law if you're doing business in the state of California, and Wisconsin Data Privacy Act, that is not enacted yet. There was a news that it would be enacted as of January 1st, 2025, but that has not been enacted. But I wouldn't be surprised if that is enacted in the future. So for the businesses who are doing business locally in Wisconsin, that's something that we need to be aware of. Yeah, so long story short, I think we are kind of wrapping up. Um, yeah, Microsoft Purview, there is this concept of compliance manager, which will help us um, all this, some of the standard regulations like GDPR, ISO 27001, and all. There are compliance managers to actually run rules based on that within Purview. So that's like all of these standard compliances are out there in Microsoft itself. So you can actually run your activate those particular rules and run your compliance checks against your data estate. Provides end-to-end data lineage, and you can have double encryption of your data. Instead of your application managed keys, you can have a customer managed key. So that's an added security that the customer holds the keys, and you can have that. And then identity and accountability means like you can only give the required people the right level of access. And Microsoft always continuously updates their certifications, right? So whether it is GDPR or some new law that comes, Microsoft always continuously keeps updating. So if you're using Microsoft tools like Purview or Fabric, you are safe because that they get certified, and those new standard rules will get added to the policies. That is well within Microsoft. Yeah, so and also Purview provides Purview data sharing, right? You don't have to let users extract the data from your system. You can actually uh, open up the governed data if you want to share to your clients. So that is also there, right? So and if you are on top of that governance, you can actually project that trust and transparency to the users who would use that data. So definitely a tool, set of tools to go after. Um, let's see what is next. Yeah, for anybody who is new or relatively new into governance, I would recommend the next steps to be performing your data estate assessment, identify what the quick wins are. I covered a lot. You cannot boil the whole ocean, right? You have to see what are your quick wins and what's your priority. You need to build a roadmap of your data governance. Data governance is not an overnight thing. It's a maturity, step-by-step maturity practice that you do one step at a time, right? And then stay informed on the new governance and regulations, so that you can ensure that you adhere to it, or have that in your roadmap. Um, yeah, so that's a slide. You can engage with concurrency experts to ensure that your data is secure, structured, and AI ready. And we can engage with the leadership team on the priorities to define a strategic roadmap, and leverage up to $7,500 for funding from Microsoft. In fact, if you're going with Microsoft tools. That's all, everybody. I know we just have 3 minutes. I don't know if I can cover all the questions, but like, I'm definitely going to get back to questions if I'm not able to cover them. Are there any questions that I could help answer in this next 3 minutes?